So what more and could and perhaps should be done to increase our chances of breaking that ongoing cycle of abuse against women? And you've touched on it a little bit there about how we need to do that. But is there anything else that you would like to add, anyone?
Yeah, shall I go ahead very quickly?
Yeah.
I think I can't remember if it was Angelica or Chantel or Sean. I do apologise. The really difficult space of perpetrator management is definitely one, and that using perpetrators who have successfully exited their behaviour as ways of encouraging other people to stop behaving in that way, and getting to that space of into the schools. And to the earlier point, I call it as male violence in women and girls because we shouldn't pretend it's anything else. And when I talk about the attitude of men towards women, I don't think these two things are binary decisions. We need to do both at the same time. We need to look after victims of crime and stop them being abused. At the same time, society needs to work much better, much more closely at developing healthier relationships. So absolutely into schools, 100%. But I think something around perpetrator management is something that I'd be encouraging.
Thank you, Raj. Angelica, did you want to come in now with your point?
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to talk about, sorry, as Raj was speaking, other things were coming into my head, sorry, so it's kind of, I was just changing what I was going to focus on. But, yeah, things like, so, there's something called a MATAC process, which is I'm going to get the acronym wrong, so multi-agency task and, Chantel, jump in there, what does the C stand for? That's bad. MATAC. Coordination, that's it, sorry. So we're going to pilot a MATAC process in Southampton, which is about holding perpetrators to account. It's about recognising where there's high risk behaviours and kind of what we would call kind of priority perpetrators, where they've had multiple victims of abuse, where there are children involved, where we can really work to try and get them into behaviour change programmes, disrupt their behaviour and make sure that we keep women and children safe from them. And I think it's those kind of, I'd say they're innovative, like MATAC processes have been around. They've been like Northumberland is one of the places where they have them as well. But a kind of a newer approach in Hampshire to be able to really hold them to account, work in a multi-agency way. And again, it comes back to all the professionals working together and identifying the risks together and identifying ways to be able to try and disrupt that pattern and support those people into behaviour change. And I think that's something that I think is really important. And I'm really pleased that we're starting to think about that in Southampton.
Thank you. Chantal, you've got your hand up. Did you have anything to add there?
Yes, yeah. I think there's various strands to this way in which we identify and engage and manage perpetrators. And, we can look at it from a criminal justice perspective. And we're doing some really good work with Aurora New Dawn in terms of the serial priority perpetrator coordinator being based in the offender management hub. And as Angelica has said, we're now going to have the MATAC that we're going to pilot. So and then we've got Project Foundation. So these are all partnerships with local agencies and with the police where we are being far more proactive in terms of identifying these perpetrators, holding them to account, looking at either engaging them in change, recognising their complex needs, or looking at how we disrupt them if we don't actually recognise that their risks are reducing. So these are all really good pieces of work, but there's something else that we need to think of, because what tends to happen is there's an over-reliance on people like police or perpetrator specialist services to actually be the ones that are identifying, engaging and having these conversations with those that are causing harm in their relationships. And actually there's a whole range of agencies and services and frontline professionals that they roam around these services, and we need to equip professionals to feel more confident, to be able to have those conversations, and to be able to kind of be curious around their relationships. So if they're attending a substance misuse service or mental health service, or they're talking to their housing officer, there's a kind of, because we don't ask those questions of professionals because we think, oh, we're not a perpetrator service or we're not the police. Actually, in not doing that, we're colluding with that behaviour, and we have to come forward and be the voice of these victims and survivors. So I think it's about everyone playing their part, everyone thinking about their assessment processes and how they go about, actually, are they confident and competent that they are identifying those that are causing harm in their services? So it's beyond a criminal justice issue and beyond a specialist perpetrator service such as Hampton Trust. And we've got the DARE toolkit, and that is absolutely designed to equip professionals to feel far more confident at being able to ask those questions in the same way that we seek to actively identify victims and survivors in services.
Thank you, Chantal. Shona, you've got your hand up there.
Yeah, I would agree, and link it again back to what everyone was saying about making sure that we respond to behaviour at a younger age, and pulling in other professionals, because Chantal and I have discussed before the kind of increase that we're seeing in younger men whose behaviours are entirely entrenched already. So we're seeing it in our stalking services quite a lot. And, that need for us to be able to start talking in schools about violent pornography, about the kind of images of, young women and girls. There's been a recent report, academic study, with a large survey of around 4,500 young people across Europe, and about pornography. And, I think it's really illuminating, actually. It showed that rates for regular viewing of online pornography were much higher among young boys. And then the link between boys' perpetration of sexual coercion and abuse was significantly associated with regular viewing of online pornography. And we're starting to see that in our services. So the perpetrators are younger. They are very sexually violent. And, those are all the kinds of topics and conversations that we need to be having across the board in statutory organisations, in schools, in various different settings. And agree with Chantal, it's not just an issue for the police. It's definitely an issue that we need to address earlier, because by the time they get to perpetration services, and I don't work with perpetrators, but by the time, obviously we've got victims whose perpetrators or ex-partners have been involved with those services. By the time it gets to that, those behaviours are often very entrenched, and it's a difficult kind of task that my colleagues in organisations like the Hampton Trust have to be able to unpick that stuff. We need to start being really honest, actually, about the way that women and girls are viewed, and I think pornography is a key aspect to that.
And just coming in on that's a really good point, Shona, about getting in there before the behaviours are entrenched. And one of the things that we're kind of, piloting in Southampton is we've got a young person, what we're calling a young person's male engagement worker project. So this idea is that we work with young fathers in particular who might be using harmful behaviours in their relationships, but it's not yet entrenched, and it's not just about the kind of saying, right, this person is a perpetrator of domestic abuse. It's about saying this young man is starting to use those harmful behaviours, and we want to get in there before it really does become entrenched and it becomes part of a wider pattern of coercive controlling behaviour. And it's really, I just wanted to echo that. I think that's really important. And we're really, in Southampton, we're really trying to find kind of new ways that we can try and address that. And just going back to Chantal, the kind of, you were picking up on that point on kind of educating professionals. Anybody on here that's in, that can get the DARE training, it's absolutely brilliant, and I'd recommend you absolutely do that. And again, the project that I run in Southampton, so the Male Engagement Worker Project, a really big part of my role is talking to professionals regularly and kind of routinely about where we've started to see abusive behaviours, and providing that kind of point of reference for professionals to be able to come and talk to us and say, we've started to notice this in a family, we've seen a father behave in a certain way, how do we get him some support? And we can do case consultations to kind of address that. And I think it's, the more that we talk about it and the more that we make it kind of not taboo or routine is really, really vital. So just another big up for the DARE training, because I think it's brilliant.
Thanks, Angelica. Raj, you have your hand up.
Yeah, a former Hampshire and Isle of Wight police colleague who now works for the PCC, Rhiannon Stark, does a sobering presentation on incel and the incel community. And that is a clear and present danger which touches on the use of pornography, but actually goes deeper than that. There's a real feeling that there's a growing number of men who feel that they are entitled to have sexual relationships, entitled. And these groups do appear to be growing and do appear to be taking root. And that's, I think society is potentially sleepwalking into that. I don't have any solutions, but it's just an observation. I'm sure I can arrange for Rhiannon to give a presentation to people if they want to hear it. It's quite sobering.
Thank you. And Chantal?
I'm really just kind of, as we're talking about pornography, just completely echoing Shona, Raj and Angelica's points here. And from our work in schools, I mean, the level of violent pornography, and in terms of that's how particularly young men are identifying kind of, that's their idea of intimacy. That's well, it's not intimacy, is it? But that's their idea of what a sexual relationship with. And we've done lots of work over the years in schools where they thought it's entirely normal that if you engage in sexual activity, that actually violence alongside that and during that is just a normal course. And also the whole thing that we know, and it's long talked about, and sometimes it gets lost in violent pornography, is what is consent and what is informed consent, and all of these things. I completely agree with you, Raj. It's not that we've got answers, it's just that we're watching it absolutely snowball, and the issue is getting bigger and bigger, and the scenarios and the cases and examples we're hearing are just getting more and more worrying. So this is not going to go away, and it's we really need some serious funding, identified funding available in the next year or two to address this, because these are the adult perpetrators of the future, but they are highly dangerous unless we address it now.
Thank you, Chantal. That I think was, this whole discussion has been a really, really important point actually about looking to the future and how we can try and preempt some of these issues. I'm going to move on now to the next question, which just starts to look a little bit more at Hampshire specifically. There are regular reports nationally about violence against women perpetrated by those who should be there to protect them. What do you think that Hampshire is doing differently at the moment?
Yeah, at the risk of stealing all of the airtime, what we're doing internally is we're calling it out as male violence against women and girls. And I myself have personally attended across the constabulary, having quite pointed and direct conversations with male colleagues around the sort of culture that could encourage unprofessional behaviour. I have to say from the offset, the vast majority of police people do a really good job in really difficult circumstances. However, It's clear to see nationally that that's not always the case. And so we're starting this, rather than call it out, calling it in culture, where we call somebody in and say, that sort of behaviour, that sort of attitude is unhealthy. When someone has overstepped the mark, we do pursue it properly and make sure we try our best that the ultimate sanction is applied, or the most appropriate sanction is applied. But I personally travel the length and breadth of the constabulary, talking in fairly stark terms about my expectations. I always pose the question of colleagues: if a significant female member of your family or friendship group wanted to join the police, what's your initial thought? And more often than not, there's a sharp intake of breath, to which I reply, that means you're not comfortable with the current culture.
That's really interesting, isn't it, Raj? Yeah. Thank you. Shona?
Yeah, so Hampshire are obviously doing their scrutiny panel, which they've invited independent organisations to come on board and look at cases of personnel, so police staff and police officers who are victims and also perpetrators of domestic abuse. And that's a really encouraging move. It's it's an important aspect of what they do. But, what's important to understand is that, just today, we've had a serving Metropolitan Police officer who's been charged with 2 counts of rape, PC Rupert Edwards. What victims and survivors see is not necessarily, identifiable to geography. They see, police officers, being charged with these issues, and of course it loses confidence in going to the police. So organisations like ours will say, dial 999 if you're in danger, and that's imperative. What we need to make sure to back up, the trust in the police and, across the UK, is this huge culture change that is needed, and it's a top-down culture change, and it's, we cannot continue to have any narrative that this is, and I'm not suggesting that Hampshire do this or Raj has said this, but I would say this, holistically, that this is one bad apple. It's not. And, victims need to see a really robust response to that. And I think what's encouraging is that Hampshire's done the scrutiny stuff. They've been doing that scrutiny stuff for some time, and, they are challenging conversations. I attend them myself, but they are very receptive within the constabulary. But, overall, victims just need to know that they can trust those that are meant to protect them. And these cases will keep coming because culturally, within police forces, it is a sexist and, there are misogynistic elements to it. It's a hierarchical institution and, it's male dominated. So that is going to be an aspect. So there needs to be embedded culture change in that response. And, I look forward to and welcome a real kind of top-down approach to that from the Home Office, actually, to make sure that actually we can respond and victims and survivors can start to trust, because there are, as Raj said, some very good officers, and it undermines the work that they do, and it also just undermines the whole system.
Yeah, can I come in on that? Sorry, just as because I absolutely agree that I agree with everything that Shona has said there, and as well as kind of getting their own house in order in terms of the kind of members of the police individually. There's also more that the police can do to kind of build trust and confidence amongst victims, especially with things like, issuing protective orders. So I know in Hampshire that they are really looking at making sure that doing training around stalking protection orders, for example, and making sure that those are being issued appropriately. But actually on the ground, so as I said earlier, I'm based in an IDFA service, and, we very rarely see these orders that are freely available to the police being used. So where there might not be charges that are going to be made we don't have, they're just not being used. And I think in terms of helping, when victims hear in the news or when they experience personally, cases being dropped or feeling like they see that, their cases very rarely get to trial, and issues like that, their kind of trust and confidence is going to be eroded. And I think that's just one thing that it's not just an issue in Hampshire. I know that it's an issue kind of nationwide, that we have these tools in our toolbox. So I'm just thinking specifically of domestic violence protection orders and protection notices, stalking protection orders, that could just be made better use of. So I think I just wanted to kind of really focus on that as well, that it's not just about, there's kind of two issues here. There's the first one, which is about having those trust and confidence that the officers that you're actually going to are themselves not perpetrators of violence, but also making sure that the police are doing everything in their power to be able to protect people. And again, that comes back down to education, I think, and the officers on the ground and the people that get to make those decisions feeling really confident that they know what orders can be made, and making sure that they're applying for them appropriately.
Thank you. Raj, did you have something to add there? Your hand's up.
Yes, so a number of points. There are many moving parts in the criminal justice system, at which at any given point a case could be dropped or not proceeded with. Lay on top of that the impact of COVID on court waiting times, and the longer a victim of crime has to wait, the more likelihood they will just withdraw the allegation. But I mean, I have to say that UK policing needs to get its act together. But there are other professions that these sorts of behaviours don't get commented upon quite as much. On any given day, you can look at the NHS, education, social services, any number of big organisations where there have been inappropriate, poor behaviour. And there's got to be a balance between just putting all the ills of the world on the police service as if the ills of the world don't exist elsewhere. That's not to say we are less rubbish than anybody else, therefore go elsewhere. We will entirely and absolutely and rightly so get our own house into order. I'd just like there to be just a little bit more recognition that it's not just the police service. This is a massive societal issue. Massive societal issue.
Agreed. Thank you, Raj. I think there was a report released only in the last couple of weeks that looked at the fire service for exactly the same issue, and we know that the armed forces and various other large institutions also do hit the headlines with these kind of issues regularly, it seems. Chantal, can I invite you? You've got your hand up there.
I was just echoing what you've summarised with, that you're right, and I agree, Raj. Yeah, definitely it is an issue that the police need to kind of improve on nationally, but we've had cases where we're supporting victims of sexual violence and conducted against them by the NHS, and there was no accountability. We've worked with a client for 5 years and there was no accountability whatsoever. It took a lot of time to actually finally get the result that was required, and it is brushed under the carpet in a huge number of large organisations. So it is about how we and how the government can hold all these other large organisations in these kind of helping and sort of powerful positions. What are they doing about the VOG agenda? Because again, you don't really see much about the NHS addressing VOG when it comes to 16 days of action, or a whole host of other organisations. I think we could do a lot better on that.
Thank you. And it's been mentioned earlier on, but in terms of national support, there's been significant progress nationally to try and put violence against women and domestic abuse higher up the agenda. The Domestic Abuse Bill was signed into law in 2021. And there have been various other different reports and frameworks that have been created. But what more do you think the government could be doing to enable some of this partnership working that we've been talking about today? Yep, jump in, Angelica. Thank you.
Yeah, so I've got, funnily enough, got loads of ideas about what needs to be happening. I mean, one of the first things I really want to raise is the issue around no recourse to public funds and migrant women. So earlier this year, the Istanbul Convention was ratified, but the government opted out of 2 key articles which provided support for migrant women. So this creates a 2-tier system where some migrant victims are not afforded the same protection from domestic abuse as non-migrant victims, as the fear of deportation prevents many from leaving abusive relationships. So we have people that are kind of faced with a really stark choice of domestic abuse or deportation and destitution. We also we've seen it in the IDVA service. We really see women where we can't get them into a position of safety because of the no recourse to public funds issue, and the battle that we have to have with agencies around who would have some responsibility, especially where there might be children involved as well, is really challenging. So I think a really key thing that needs to happen is that we need to address the issue around no recourse to public funds. I think in terms of the other issues that I was thinking about is, funding into research into an evidence base for perpetrator programs. I think, I don't know whether this is something Chantal would have a view on as well, is just so often what is kind of presented to people such as me and the Hampton Trust, where we're working with perpetrators of domestic abuse, is that, where's the evidence base? So we've had some projects like the Mirable project, and other bits at Hampton Trust have obviously had things like the CARA programme evaluated, but there's still this kind of this feeling like there's not enough evidence around what really works. So it'd be really great to have some good kind of long-term funding around creating that evidence base, so that we really can start to kind of make progress and making sure that all the programs that are offered are of a good quality. And in terms of, again, with funding kind of within domestic abuse, we just don't have consistent long-term funding. Lots of organisations are going from year to year or maybe 3-year contracts, and that just doesn't provide consistency. And again, kind of national refuge provision, that's funded at a local level. So again, it's a kind of postcode lottery. And I think, we talk a good game nationally around domestic abuse, and there is more funding and there's more investment, but it's not quite there. And we still seem to be having this kind of, I think, again, it's gotten better, and Chantal might be able to speak to this a bit more, as you know, she working in this field for a lot longer than I have, but there's still that kind of feeling that perpetrator work is taking away from victim support services, and it really should never be considered as an either or. It needs to be considered that it's both is needed, because we cannot keep women and children safe if we aren't able to work directly with the perpetrators as well. It's like 2 sides of the same coin, basically. So the key things that I kind of highlight that for me is the issue around no recourse to public funds, making sure that we have funding for an evidence base for perpetrator programs, and the need for consistent long-term funding for domestic abuse services, and a national refuge provision that isn't just kind of left down to the local level. I think we need to try and get rid of that postcode lottery.
Thank you. Raj?
Yeah, I'm going to go very left field here. The people that are charged with making the law and the policy, House of Commons in itself, numerous allegations around atmosphere of what it's like to be a woman in the House of Commons. I'd like to start off with MPs and do some research into male attitude towards women. What exactly is happening there? Because if we're depending on the House of Commons to develop policies that support the prevention and stopping of domestic abuse, And I think we really need to understand what are the attitudes of those policymakers. I mean, I do recollect when, before Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, him and his then girlfriend, there was a fight and shouting and screaming. And that the Prime Minister, that police obviously attended. The amount of pushback from MPs saying, oh, well, the police overreacted, they should never have gone, says to me, do they really get it? We need to get into, I think, to the heart of the policymakers to understand, do they really get it? Because we depend on them to build the policy and they don't get it. I think we're building on shaky ground.
Thank you. Chantel.
Thank you, Raj. I'm sure Shona can speak to that comment, but I completely agree with you on, I don't even get me started. But yes, there's a lot of work to do around the government response and approach and their attitudes towards women. So I would echo anything in that area. But actually, I'm going to speak about something entirely different to perpetrators, which is unusual for me to mention something else where there's a huge gap. And I would like to address the fact around, finally, after years and years, we now have children recognised as victims in their own right and not just bystanders of domestic abuse and domestic violence. Yet actually, I've not yet really seen that translate to anything fundamentally different on the ground. And we're still waiting for a perpetrator strategy. I said I wouldn't mention it, but I have quickly. We're still waiting. I don't know how long that's going to take. And we have the VORG strategy. But what I would like to see is something much more concrete around, now that you've recognised children as victims, where is the funding at government level to support that? Because actually, it feels like to commission services for the victim services and the perpetrator services, they seem a little bit of an in-between, an add-on. They don't really fit into the perpetrator services, and they're not, it's a bit piecemeal in terms of what's available for children in refuge and in communities. So for me, I think this is a huge gap. It's all right to recognise them as victims finally, but I think we need to translate that to what we're going to do to provide for them and how we're going to prevent them.
Thank you.
Shona. Yeah, totally agree, Chantal, and I agree with everything that everyone's said already. I mean, there's no nice way of putting it or strategic way of putting it. We need money. We need actual adequate funding for the male violence against women sector, and it's as Angelica's already said, it's very piecemeal. You're lucky if you get a 3-year grant, or contracts are slightly different, but it's really important that we recognise that it's underfunded and under-resourced. I think one of the things that I would like to see the government do, and I know the DA Commissioner is doing some great work around domestic homicide reviews, but is to acknowledge and recognise and have MPs speak to and about the femicide census, which is a heartbreaking read, but an amazing piece of work that's been done and led by Karen Ngala-Smith. There are recommendations in that report, but yet I'm yet to see any MP talking about that. And that in itself is an issue when feminists have gone away, done all of the heartbreaking work around the thousands of women who have died, and that's really important. We still see one woman murdered every 3 days by a man in the UK. The other thing that I would would say, and just picking up on Angelica's point around the DA Act and leaving migrant women out, is to make sure that that the government understand that we have to have buy-in for led responses by a specialist independent sector that has so much knowledge. That's buy-in for Black and minoritised ethnic women, buy-in for women in itself, disabled women, elderly women.
they are being left out of a lot of those responses. And I would also add that, there are 9 protected characteristics, and, all of them deserve equal responses in terms of violence and abuse, and that it's absolutely right that we are able to respond in a way that ensures that people from their own community can appropriately deliver services for their community. That's I see sometimes, a lot in terms of funding that being swallowed up. So the mentions are there, but then it's open to, any big non-specialist charity to apply. And that's not what By and For is about. The Male Violence Against Women movement was set up by and for women who experienced violence and abuse in their homes. That's what happened in the 60s and the 70s, and they did it on a budget of nothing. We need to hold on to the roots of the movement and ensure that others are supported adequately by their own communities and amplify their voices.
Thank you. And Angelica, I see you've got your hand up, and then we'll move to questions.
Yeah, sorry, just one last thing that I put it as a comment, but just again around one of the issues that I think we really need to work on is around educating the judiciary and in family courts. We see a lot of post-separation abuse. So again, I can't remember who it was that was saying earlier as well, like it's not just, I think it was Raj, it's not just about violence, like the coercive control and the ongoing abuse post-separation. And family courts are still a place in which perpetrators can really effectively continue to abuse their ex-partners and their children. And I think it's really important that we have some kind of training and awareness and a way to kind of hold judges to account when they are colluding with perpetrators. And I really would like to see that addressed nationally.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And thank you to all of our speakers today. You've given some amazing discussion. It's been really, really interesting questions. So I'm going to hand back to Kirsten now to run through those for you.
So, yes, I think there's one question from Tallulah. Shona already responded to it, I think, but I'm going to read it out anyway, in case someone else had something to say. So Tallulah is asking, having heard panel members say that violence against women need to be defined very clearly in multiple ways, would the panel agree that domestic violence and sexual violence is almost unanimously perpetrated against one sex, females, from males, and that this needs to be defined in language and law? So is there anyone would like to answer that or respond to that?
I mean, I've already answered it on Twitter, but, I'm happy to kind of reiterate that. The statistics are overwhelming, and, we know that women are experiencing violence and abuse based largely from men. What's important is that we separate out the terminology gender and sex, because they are used interchangeably and, they don't mean the same thing. And that's not to say that other people don't experience violence and abuse, but when we look at the overwhelming majority of statistics, we know that it's male violence against women, and it's based on the sex of the victim and the sex of the perpetrator. So, any return to that in terms of policy capture is incredibly important. I just recently looked at the model for trauma-informed work set out by the government, which is a great document, but they talk about gender-based violence. And when we're talking about trauma-informed work, reiterating back to my comment about By and For models of support, many women want a space that is just for them, that is a women-only space, and that is based on their sex. So we need to make sure that when we're talking about gender and sex, we do so in the right way and using the right terminology, and ensuring that everybody gets a service that is akin to their needs.
Chantal, do you want to go and add to that?
I just echo Shona's comments entirely. It is about male violence against women, and it is about giving women safe spaces. And in our work with female offenders, we know that they've experienced domestic abuse and sexual violence, and what we're doing when we work with them is ensuring that it is a female-only space, that they are only contacted by females, and that their experience from when they come into contact with our service is with females. So it is definitely about male violence against women and girls.
Yeah, I think Raj made that quite clear in his responses earlier as well about him calling it male violence against women and girls, because that evidence is obviously large. Thank you. I think this brings us to the end of our discussion. We've run slightly over the time anticipated for that originally, but I think it just shows how much everyone has to still say and contribute on this subject. I thank you all very much for your time today, taking an hour out of your days to have this conversation and put yourself out there. Thank you very, very much. It's been really informative and interesting to listen to, and hopefully we can do that again soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. Thanks for having me.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.